Hello, everybody, and welcome to the second lecture in our series on principles of managing organizations. This is Daryl Polk, your instructor. So what we're going to do is carry forward from our lecture from last week and go deeper on some of the management models that we discussed and start applying some of the philosophies that we gleaned out as being very influential on current managing theory. So last week we talked about Winslow versus Fail and how scientific method versus kind of management principles came to evolve. And as we discussed with Winslow, he's the father of scientific method, which was very much more about purpose and getting people into specialized positions to execute specialized duties. And really, that became the foundation of the modern movement for automation and to work towards having more physical tasks or less intellectually engaging tasks handled through automation or through mechanization. So, in contrast, you have Fail, who really looked at people-centric management principles. He definitely believed in the relationship between an employer and an employee and looked at it much more as like a familial relationship, that an organization had obligations to employees to develop them and make them as relevant as possible as things change within the organization. And Fail is probably the godfather of modern managerial philosophy. So you have a lot of different management principles and management theories that emerged from his research and from kind of his assertions on it. So last week we talked about this structure of four elements of management: structure, leadership, vision, and execution. And so today what we're going to do is drill down and talk about two of the elements, which are vision and structure. And I'm going to use those as foundational elements to kind of move through the lecture series. And at the end of it, we're going to see how all of these interrelate. So on top of that, I'm going to layer our textbook, which is It's Your Ship by D. Michael Abrashoff, and compare elements from the book to this structure and kind of show how it fits in and how it supports it and how it might deviate from it. So if you look at Fail's elements of management, last week we talked about these 14 elements, but there were a set of about 6 macro elements that kind of guided those smaller sets. And what Fail kind of proposed is that management was composed of organization, command, prevoyance, and control and coordination. And so what I've done is kind of layered those over the model that I came up with. And show how they fit into that. And understand that I didn't kind of pull this model out of thin air. This is kind of a compilation of what I've seen with other management principles, and it's really much more prevalent. I'm not inventing anything here. I'm just visualizing it in a way that I feel works for what I want to communicate in the class. So Fail looked at structure in terms of organization, and I think that it's kind of an interchangeable term. When I'm talking about structure, what I'm talking about is kind of the scaffolding that makes people feel secure in an organization because they understand everybody's relationship and role. And I think Fail had the same interpretation of organization from his perspective. On vision, Fail termed it prevoyance and looked at it in 2 elements as forecasting and planning. And I look at forecasting and planning as being interdependent, that forecasting without planning really has very little value because you're not really working towards the thing you're forecasting. And planning without forecasting kind of leads to aimless work. It means that people may or may not be supporting the goals of the organization. You know, he looked at leadership as command, and I've termed it leadership, or used more of the leadership term, because I think that since Fail's time, it's become a much softer skill and it's much more subjective. It's not just people having authority, it's how you exercise influence. And then we look at execution, which he had as control and coordination, actually had them as separate disciplines. What I've done is combine them and basically say that, you know, control is having some type of organizational structure that allows for messaging to come from either the top or the center of the organization out to the people who are actually conducting work, and then coordination, which is making sure that everybody's working in concert, that everybody's working towards the same macro goal and achieving the same vision. So when we talk about vision, we're really talking about articulating the organization's purpose. It's coming back to a why statement. Why does this organization exist in the first place? So in terms of the Navy, the Navy was founded near the birth of the nation, and it was the idea that at that point in time, the high seas were where much of warcraft was waged. It was the logistics foundation for armies, and we were at the age of expedition and exploration, so navies played an incredibly important role in maintaining a nation's presence around the world. And what we're going to do is kind of look at that in the context of, okay, is their vision the same as it was at their foundation? And to really execute a vision well, you have to continually examine that future and draw up plans of action. And the example that I'll give on this is Eastman Kodak. So Eastman Kodak was the world's largest film company in the 20th century. And their vision when they were founded was bringing photography to the masses. It was allowing people who were not professional photographers access to taking photographs and owning photographs. And what you have to understand, for those of you who are under 35, you probably never worked with film unless you're kind of into that niche photography now. But prior to the invention of the digital camera and the phone camera, you had film cameras, and regardless of whether it was professional grade 35 millimeter or a little snapshot camera, you had a film canister that you had to take and have developed somewhere. So with these film canisters, what it did is it allowed the convenience of not having to develop your own film. If any of you have ever done film development, it's a pretty laborious process. You have to bathe the paper in certain chemicals that bring out certain parts of the image, and then some of the chemicals are actually toxic, and you have to be careful with them, and the timing has to be right, and if you expose it to light, it can wash out the exposure, and it's pretty complex and intricate, and it definitely wasn't for the average layman. So what Eastman Kodak did is came up with these canisters that would protect the film until it got developed. So all you had to do was take your pictures, take the canisters, drop them off somewhere, and have them developed. And if you ever see a strip center with a weird little building in the parking lot that looks like a hut that could hold one person, and they probably have an ATM in it now, but 35 years ago, there was a person in there, and that person's job was to pick up film and deliver pictures to people when their film was developed. So they were little photo booths. So anyways, it was the most convenient method at the time to do this. And what Eastman Kodak's vision was is getting photography to the masses, which was a really cool vision, and it still applied. But at the dawn of the digital camera in the 1990s, Eastman Kodak could have made a pivot and said, wow, there's a new technology on the horizon. This allows us to meet our vision even better, that we can now have people with the immediacy of taking the photo, seeing the photo, and not having to develop it. How can we work that into our model? Instead, they kind of went into denial, and they moved off their vision and moved on to what they were doing. Nope, we were a film company, we produce film, we develop film, and we're going to continue doubling down on that because, and I don't know whether it was just denial or whether at the time they thought digital was going to be too expensive or out of reach of the average consumer, but sure enough, their gamble was horrible for Eastman Kodak. They went bankrupt in the late 90s, early 2000s, and ceased to exist as a company. So the lesson to learn on that is that you have to develop a vision that you can stick to, and when the vision's expired, is there a reason for the organization? If you want to continue the organization past the vision, do you have to develop a new vision? And you have to create buy-in and a common belief that we're going to support this vision regardless of what we're doing. And if we need to make turns to support that, we'll make those turns. So these are the guys that have done that well. And the reason I bring these three guys up is you're probably, regardless of what generation you're in, you're familiar with them. So you have Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, Steve Jobs. And so Steve Jobs, the interesting part with Steve Jobs is that we're able to see kind of both the effects of having a dynamic leader that can create that vision and communicate it, but also what happens when that leader fades. So with Steve Jobs and Apple, Steve Jobs' vision was to create technology that has an allure to it and that's sexy and that makes people want to use it, where people are hungry for technology. Prior to that, really only geeks cared about technology. You had your Motorola flip phone, but it was more, if you're in the business, then that's a status symbol, having a StarTAC or a flip phone. I think he saw that appetite, and even before the flip phone and all of these things, he saw that if you make it sexy enough, if you make it cool enough, and if you make it usable enough, people will flock to it, and they'll find ways to make it affordable. The idea of people owning $1,000 mobile device in masses was unthinkable prior to Apple pushing the envelope on that. And what they did is they didn't make it cheaper so much as they made the appetite for it enough that people fit that into their budget. So telcos subsidized it, telephone companies began subsidizing phones so people could get it in reach. But people said, there's enough of my disposable income that I will buy that, and actually change some of their buying habits to get in there. And what we've seen in his absence is that the company has moved off of their vision and onto their what. So Tim Cook is not following the vision of Steve Jobs that we are going to continue to make really sexy, really cool devices that attract people to it. He's now saying we make phones, we make tablets, we make computers. We're going to make them at the most profitable margin, and we're going to increase sales in whatever way we can. So now you're seeing Apple kind of floundering where people aren't amazed by it. People's reaction to Apple isn't, wow, that is incredible. It's, oh, that's cool. Oh, I guess that's cool. So, looking at Mark Zuckerberg, Mark Zuckerberg was one of the first people to have this vision of we're going to develop a company that is based on sharing information and people sharing their interactions. But the revolutionary part was we're not going to look for money on the outset. We're just going to look for building as large a base as we can and not making people pay for it. And we'll monetize it later. Once we have the audience, we can monetize the audience. But talk about a huge gamble. And even now, they're still kind of just coming to the point where Facebook is actually turning a legitimate profit, where it's actually making money and offsetting its costs. It took a decade for them to build a model where they said we're actually making money. Prior to that, it was all speculation. But it was him having the vision of saying, if I can build an audience of 6 billion people, I can sell that. I can make money on that. And to this day, Facebook has very few, if any, services that you pay for. There are ancillary services you tack on that you can pay for, but it's still a free service. And it's understanding that, if it's free, then you are the product. But he was able to communicate that into a vision that he was able to stay with. And then finally, Elon Musk is probably the best example of this. So Elon Musk is a true visionary. This is a guy who wanted nothing less than to change the world on multiple fronts. He wants to get us back into space exploration. He wants to revolutionize transport. He wants to revolutionize how people own transportation and work with transportation. So using Tesla as kind of the example, the standard car company, if you look at the companies that have emerged in the market over the last 30 to 40 years, Hyundai, Kia, some of the relatively newer companies, their model for getting into the market was we're going to build we're going to build the cheapest cars first, get as many people to buy those cheap cars as possible, simply because they're more affordable than the other cars in the market brand. And we'll steadily build them up to have a better reputation, build our brand name, and eventually have the same market presence that the larger, more established companies have, like Honda, Toyota, and Nissan. And the difficulty they've had, and this is not disparaging them, if you own one of these cars, I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but Hyundai and Kia's struggle is convincing people that their high-end cars have the same value and brand identity as other high-end cars from Mercedes, BMW, Lexus, Infiniti, and they are struggling with that. Hyundai introduced their Equus line that was their top end, and it's just not identifiable. People don't look at the car and say, wow, I really want to own an Equus when I grow up. Now, what Elon Musk did is he flipped that model on its head and said, I don't care about cars. I care about moving the world off of fossil fuels. So what I'm going to do is produce a car that is all electric, that has the potential to be zero emission, and I'm going to make it as sexy and desirable as possible, kind of the Steve Jobs model. I could care less about cost, but I'm going to put this out there so people pay attention to it and desire it. And the first Tesla Roadsters were just that. They came out and they were a contemporary of Ferrari and Lamborghini, and you had celebrities and billionaires that were buying them, and it was this really unique car that when you saw it on the road, you took notice. You actually turned your head to see that, wow, that's a Tesla. And what he's done is gradually made it more accessible. The Tesla Model S became the four-door sedan that suddenly it's within a range of the non-exotics, and it's still a really high-priced car, but it's suddenly accessible to a much larger group of people. And you see him kind of trickling it down to where, like this Tesla Model 3 that sold almost 200,000 cars sight unseen, without anybody ever having driven one. It's that appetite that he built up. And the beauty of it is it has nothing to do with selling Tesla 3s. In the meantime, he's worked out deals to build battery packs for homes and to buy a solar company. He's in the process right now of buying Solar City for $3 billion. So now you see the vision coming into play as, oh, this guy isn't about buying cars. He's about dismantling the current model of cars running on gasoline. He's developing a model where cars are completely independently fueled, where you can have a solar pack on your house that feeds the battery, that feeds the car, and now you're not dependent on external infrastructure and you're not dependent on fossil fuels in any way for that car to be on the road. That's visionary, and that is taking a long-term play, and it's getting people to buy into that as you work that vision through. So going back to our friends in the Navy, the Navy before the latest turning point was operating on the post-World War II Navy. And it was definitely designed for empire on empire conflicts. It was, how do we get ready for the next World War? The enemies may change, but the tactics will stay the same. Where it's ship-on-ship battles, it's brute force approach, it's putting lead and explosives on targets. So for the 50 years after World War II, that was the Navy's operation, and their model stayed pretty much the same. There was some modernization. There certain things kind of became automated over time, and that started putting stress on the system, but there wasn't a real burning desire to change their overall vision until 9/11. So September 11th, 2001, we were all familiar with that. We're all familiar with the impacts of that day. But the impact it had on the Navy is it told them that your enemy is no longer a nation state, that you're not worried about going to war with Russia or Germany or China. You're worried about going to war with radical religious groups, with radical Islam groups, where you're worried about going to war with small terrorist organizations that can inflict huge harm with limited resources. And they're not going to roll out battleships. The Taliban does not have a destroyer. Al-Qaeda does not have an aircraft carrier. They're not going to meet them in the traditional Navy battle. So that means that the traditional Navy mission isn't the same. Now, if the Navy's vision is keeping our nation secure using the high seas, then sticking with how they did it prior to 9/11 isn't going to work anymore. They're not going to fulfill their vision. They could easily double down and say, we're just going to continue building battleships and aircraft carriers, and we'll just brute force our approach. We'll carpet bomb these countries into submission. But what the Navy did is they said, you know what? We have to be more agile. We have to be more responsive. We have to be more small conflict oriented, and we have to be able to build a fleet that meets that new mission. But more importantly, we have to be able to recruit and train and retain a new type of sailor in order to make that effective. All of these warships are totally ineffective if they don't have people working them and guiding them. So you have a whole new workforce. So what Abrashoff was getting at with his book is exactly that the 21st century Navy has to treat their workforce completely differently than they treated it in the 20th century. And part of that, when we get into chapter 3 in the book, he starts off with listening aggressively. And this is interesting because it's a complete flip on the Navy prior to this change in paradigm. The idea of executive leadership caring about what lower leadership or the sailors at the tail end of the leadership change, the idea of them caring what they had to say was ridiculous. There was nobody in the Admiralty that cared what a line level sailor thought who was pulling up anchor and swabbing decks. But what Abrashoff said is that you don't have those workers at the tail end anymore, and that's not our Navy anymore. And that the people at the tail end of these food chains are the people who are enacting and executing all of these decisions made on high, from the president on down. And they're the people we need to talk to. They're the people that have the best ideas. They're the people who need to be steering the organization. So what it means is we have to start by listening to them, listening literally, and by listening literally, it means not just hearing the individual words, but looking for the meaning behind the words. It's actually actively trying to get their message. And there's a really horrible trend in human communication where listening has been supplanted by people waiting there patiently to say what they're going to say regardless of what the other person is saying. And active listening is saying what I have to say isn't important right now, what you have to say is. And I want to hear that. And it's about asking questions and restating things to show that you understand what they've said. And part of this is the ability to ask tough questions and expect tough answers. An effective manager wants to get information on their processes, on their groups, on their teams, regardless of whether it's viewed as good or bad. The bad is more important than the good in many ways. It's nice to hear that things are going well. It's nice to hear that people are happy. But it's more important to hear that things are not going well and people are not happy, because that's what you have to address. That's your responsibility as a manager. And the only way you're going to get that information is by getting out there and figuring out how you can effectively listen to people. And part of that is don't react, respond. We'll get into this a little more later on, but the idea is that our human tendency is to become defensive when challenged. So when we have somebody who challenges our authority by questioning things that we're doing or things that we support or current modes of operation, our natural instinct is to react. It's to jump back on them. And this is what people are ready for. This is on the other side of the equation. Line level employees assume that if I go to the boss with bad news, bad things will happen to me. They will kill the messenger. So the trick is remove yourself from that and respond, don't react. React is coming back with an emotional message, with something that's tied to you. Anything that's tied to emotion means it's tied to you, not to the organization. So if you come back either angry or bitter, or if you snap, or if you cry, or if you laugh and ridicule, all of those things are not for the benefit of the organization. It's for your benefit. It's to quell your own insecurities on having to hear information that may call into question how effective you're doing as a manager. And what I'm saying is value that, don't diminish it. So this is about seeing the ship through the crew's eyes. It's also about, once you have that information, being able to communicate, because there's another element that you serve on this, and that's the grand vision that we talked about before. And you have to be able to communicate that vision and the purpose for the organization. And the best managers do it in that context of soliciting information from line level staff, synthesizing it with the vision, and then coming out and communicating why we're doing things, defining goals and objectives in the context of, hey, I've listened to what you've brought to the table, and here's how we should do it. And then forming that into mission statements and organizational values and long and short-term goals. But it's an iterative process. It's not linear. It's not static. It's not we develop a mission statement and live the mission statement for the rest of our lives. It's about soliciting information from people in the organization at all levels and constantly evaluating whether we're meeting our vision or not. Are we fulfilling our purpose? Has the world changed and our purpose changed? Or has the world changed, our purpose is the same, but how we execute our purpose has changed? So this is a foundational piece. This is something that kind of feeds into our next piece, which is on structure. So structure is really about providing a safe environment for people to perform their jobs and people to perform their tasks. And a big part of structure is examining the future and drawing up plans of action that make sure that it's adaptive and make sure that it's meeting the needs as we move forward. So, when we talk about elements of organizational structure and elements of these strategies, we have to look at kind of the traditional uh, view of different departments, divisions, units, teams, and groups. And what I want to do is kind of lay out kind of a history of it and look at the different models that are in play. So we have vertical specialization, which is definitely a Winslow-esque approach to things. It's also known as bureaucratic structure. We touched on this a little bit in our first lecture. It's top-down authority, clear definition of rank, not necessarily an effective chain of command. And what this is this is how we kind of by default think of leadership in organizations. We tend to look at it as the people with mahogany desks at the top, middle managers, our supervisors that people report to, and then line staff who are the people executing jobs. And this model is still in play. There are a lot of organizations that subscribe to it. But in the context of the Navy, what they figured out is this is the model they operated on for the first 250 years of existence. And there came a day when this model no longer served them effectively. It may have decayed over time, but eventually, even with decay, there comes a point when there's structural failure. And I think the Navy figured out they were hitting a point of structural failure where, because the mission had changed, the workforce had changed, the technology had changed, this very linear, top-down execution style was no longer serving their needs. So what you saw from that is kind of this evolution into horizontal specialization, which is where tasks kind of got broken off into different groups, and those groups may have had division managers or group supervisors, but it's the idea that we have people. If you're building a car, you have people building the engine, you have people building the body, you have people building the chassis, you have people building the interior, and they're all responsible for their different tasks, and there may be a lot of interplay within the group, but there's not a lot of interplay between the groups. And it's kind of still along the lines of specialization, but it might have a little more parallel lines of authority. And within each group, you might have more interplay than you would through a completely hierarchical top-down. In a top-down, an auto worker would just screw a nut into a bolt, and that's all they care about. In this type of model, you may have a group of people that are all responsible for getting an engine assembled, and they may all do kind of different things and adapt accordingly, but it's still just the engine they're working on. So as you move forward into kind of the cutting edge structures, and this is what's coming out in more updated organizations, is this matrix structure where there's a lot of overlap. You have people who are working in collaborative groups and maybe collaborative divisions or departments, and it's the upside to it is it's very dynamic. It really pushes innovation. It allows people to kind of pursue different avenues according to the moment, but it also means that there's less inherent structure and that people feel less secure in it if they don't have strong management and strong leadership. So this is where the importance of management starts to rise as structure starts to fall. Whereas before, a manager was just responsible for telling people, show up for work on time, do your job, don't complain. Now it's coaching people. It's getting people the skills that they need and getting people the resources they need and getting people to work together effectively and communicating. All these soft skills that weren't necessarily needed of managers in the past. So when we apply it to the Navy, we look at the old Navy. We look at how the Navy under the post-World War II model had a very linear chain of command. And what you see in these photographs is evidence that what you had was very few officers and very many crew. So the photo on the top right shows this division or this group up here where you can tell who the senior officer is. He's got his tie tucked in. He's got the flying saucer hat on. He's got two mid-ranking officers at either side, and then he's got about 9 or 10 crewmen around him. And you can see how that pyramid falls out. I mean, the photograph is almost taken in a pyramid format. If you just kind of spread that out a little bit, you see one guy, two guys, 10 guys. And and then the other photographs, you see how that just extrapolates out to where at the bottom left you have hundreds of crew members and probably a handful of officers that are there as part of that. So this worked up until the workload changed, until technology started taking the place of all these crew members. And now you need more technical experts and people who are adaptive and people who can bring more intellectual insight to the job than physical labor. So now you're in this modern Navy, where if you look at the crew of this ship here, all I see is very similar officer uniforms. And there may be enlisted personnel there, but that's way more officers than you saw in other photos for these ships. And I think this is true of the modern Navy, that if you look at the tasks that everybody's performing, you have to be adaptive, you have to be technologically savvy, and you have to be fluid and flexible because you're being asked to make decisions that are much more subjective than the decisions of the past. Before, it was, we're going to put lead on enemies. So fire the gun as many times as you can. Don't worry about what it's hitting. Don't worry about who it's killing. Kill everybody on that shoreline. Whereas the new Navy is having to respond to these asymmetrical threats and having to worry about, civilian casualties, and they have an enemy that doesn't clearly identify themselves and engage them on a format where they can minimize losses to civilians. You have enemies that are trying to look like civilians and hide among civilians, and it's much more difficult. What it means, you have to have a smarter, more intellectually savvy workforce, which means they have to be managed on those terms. You need a structure that supports that. So what it means ultimately is you have to create a climate of trust for these people. The idea of the trust before came from, if I follow my boss, I will keep my job. If I follow my boss, I will not get in trouble. For the Navy, if I follow my boss, I won't wind up in the brig. So now it's not following your boss, it's doing the right thing for the right reasons at the right time. And it's doing it not because your boss tells you to, but because you're part of a group and the group depends on you to execute your job to the fullest of your abilities. And this goes back to communicating why. That for that group to kind of adopt their group morals and their group vision, it has to be communicated down by managers what the overall vision and mission of the organization is, and defining those goals and objectives in this new paradigm. So we get back to a whole mission statement, organizational values, but now we're seeing it as part of a structure, that these things are taking the place of hierarchies and org charts, and now it's becoming values and visions that are guiding people's actions moving forward. So moving into that, the overall objective with communication now is to make people feel safe in their jobs and allow truth to be spoken. And I held a workshop recently with my new team. I'm relatively new at my new job, but I have a department. And what I wanted to get across to people is that my overriding priority with the department is to set up a foundation where people feel safe speaking the truth, and that candor is the most valuable thing in the world to me. And the reason for that is the most dangerous thing for an organization now is for unspoken truths to remain unspoken, for things to happen, or for people to understand threats and not communicate them because they don't feel safe communicating bad news. And you have to, as a manager, foster that environment where people can say what they need to say and not feel threatened about it. And it goes back to listening actively and making communicating valuable. But really what it comes down to is creating this safety net, that taking the place of the old hierarchy. The old hierarchy made people feel safe doing exactly what they were told to do. The new one needs to make people feel safe doing exactly what they need to do. Doing what they need to do to keep the organization running forward. So there's a series of videos. There's another attachment here that has about a half a dozen videos that go with the lecture series. And the first one I want you to watch is this video by Simon Sinek. And it'll kind of give you the overview of why vision and communication are so important, and structure is so important in an organization. It'll kind of set the tone. There are some other videos there that have to do, like there's one that's a promotion piece for the Navy that I want you to see that kind of shows how the Navy has changed their paradigm and how they're trying to engage at all levels. There's also videos from Elon Musk talking about innovation and kind of elaborating on what I talked about earlier. There's another one by Margaret Heffernan that's a very interesting one. It has to do with the idea of organizational structure and how we've kind of adopted this culture in many facets of asking everybody to be superior employees, being the ultimate employees at their role. And her idea is that that's unfair to ask, that everybody's going to perform at different levels. You may have people that perform really well under very specific circumstances, but maybe don't shine all the time. So it's a very interesting video. And then there's another one from the RSA that's on organizational development, and have patience with that. The first parts of the video may not tie into it right away, but it's laying a foundation. As the video gets into the meat of it, you'll see how it ties back to our lecture series. So this is lecture 2. Please watch the rest of the videos, and thank you.